On the 30th of October 1942, Chuikov realised that the Germans were exhausted, and now, for the first time, he believed that he was winning the battle. Yes, Chuikov had come a long way since his most fateful day. On the evening of October 29th, the battle began to die down, and on October 30th, there were only exchanges of fire. The enemy was utterly exhausted. We knew that the Soviet troops were winning the battle. The arrival of the roughly 6,400 men of Sokolov's 45th Rifle Division, albeit only several battalions at a time, tipped the battle in Stalingrad's northern factory district in 62nd Army's favour. Chuikov wasn't wrong. Both sides were, by now, completely spent. From this moment on, there would be days of just skirmishes and small firefights, followed by short advances to take the odd building here or there. But that was it. For all intents and purposes, Paulus had failed to take Stalingrad. Any chance he had had was gone by this point. But of course, the fighting would continue. Heim slowly pushed towards the Volga to be stopped by Soviet counterattacks, while the 79th Infantry Division's defences inside the Red October factory were struck by the Soviet 120th and 253rd Regiments, pushing the Germans and Croatians back. Thus, Seydlitz had failed to capture the final ferry site on the Volga, and his forces were depleted. At this point, even Paulus stopped ordering his men to keep attacking over and over. No more would Paulus be able to mount a substantial attack as he had previously. Exhaustion of his units is listed as the reason why, but the books also suggest the fact that the Sixth Army's ammunition supplies had run low. Due to the complexities of supply, the situation with ammunition in Stalingrad deteriorated, the offensive could no longer be supported by fire in the same amount, and nocturnal disturbing shelling of the enemy on the eastern bank of the Volga is also not carried out in the required quantities. At some point around this time, Hitler ordered that the Sixth Army's 150,000 draft animals be sent over 100 miles to the rear in order to save room on the supply trains for things other than fodder. Many of their vehicles were sent back too. So from this point onwards, the Sixth Army was essentially immobile and was expected to remain in place for the rest of the winter. Worse, many of the horses didn't survive the journey due to the lack of fodder, but also the poor weather conditions. Because Hitler still demanded that his army crush the last vestiges of Soviet resistance once and for all, Paulus and Seydlitz would have to do so with company size rather than battalion or regiment size Kampfgruppen. Because neither commander thought this possible, both began to search for other solutions to this dilemma, principally reinforcements obtained from whatever quarter possible. Unfortunately, this would ultimately mean further denuding the German divisions defending elsewhere along the front. One other solution they sought to use was the 12 new Stugs that arrived to reinforce the 244th and 245th Sturmgeschütz battalions in Stalingrad. These were the Sturm Infanteriegeschütz 33Bs, mounting a large 150mm gun and designed to demolish houses in 2 to 3 hits. These had some potential, but it's hard to see how 12 assault guns, even with a heavy gun, could really impact the battle in any significant way, which just shows how much the Germans were clutching at straws by this point. Of course, things weren't rosy for Chuikov. Even though he had received reinforcement, Glantz estimates that Chuikov only had about 15,000 bayonets on the 31st of October. Chuikov's final landing stage was under threat, and the Germans were just meters from pushing him into the Volga. Chuikov's army had nearly disappeared. The hand-to-hand fighting for the factories had wiped out battalions, regiments, even entire divisions. From groups which had come into Stalingrad 7,000 to 8,000 strong, only a few hundred straggled away to fight under new commanders. The 389th Infantry Division was ordered to relieve Kampfgruppe Bilo, and Lenski's division was ordered to relieve the 212th Infantry Regiment, which would eventually place the 24th Panzer Division inside the Red October factory. Once again, the Germans were shuffling around their units in a desperate attempt to get a few more soldiers to the front line. Inside the factory, the 39th Guards Rifle Division struck Hall 5 and may have infiltrated a bit further than that, possibly to the railway line, but they were quickly repulsed by fire coming from the uncaptured sections of Hall 5, and Lenski's division counterattacked, retaking Hall 10 by nightfall and Halls 8, 8A and 9 by the next morning. You'd think that morale in the 6th Army would be low, but it was actually mixed. It really depended on the division in question. Some of the accounts, like those of 305th Infantry Division, read of despair, while others, like the 276th Infantry Regiment, were remarkably intact. The morale of the men was high, and we all had complete confidence in our leadership. With a stalemate inside the city, outside the city, the Germans started to detect some of the Soviet build-up at the Don. Reports had started coming in from at least the 25th of October, and the Romanians had complained for weeks before then. Yet General Reinhard Gehlen, who was the head of the OKH's Foreign Armies East Intelligence Service, was a little slow putting two and two together. Hitler, on the other hand, wasn't. He saw some of the build-up and on the 26th of October ordered several Luftwaffe field divisions to stiffen the Axis Allied armies on the Don. On the 29th of October, Gehlen had informed Zeitzler that there was no sign of preparation for a major attack in this sector. Then, on the 31st of October, he said there may be a chance that the Romanians may get attacked, maybe at the local level, maybe. It's no wonder then that the German High Command didn't concern themselves with the Don front at this time. Again, Hitler disagreed. He saw that the Soviets had built several new bridges across the river and concluded that a major Soviet attack would be taking place, although mistakenly believed it was heading towards Rostov to the south. So rather than ignoring the advice of his generals and causing their own defeat, Madman Hitler was ignoring his generals because they were wrong. Now begins the epic that I hinted at in the last video. Yeremenko had decided to try and assist Churikov's army and group Gorokov at Spartanovka specifically. Therefore, in the Latashanka region, at 0400 hours on the 31st of October 1942, a reinforced battalion of 910 men from the 300th Rifle Division sailed in tugboats across the river, with all three of the first wave boats reaching the bank in one piece. The 420 riflemen in this first wave conducted an amphibious landing like Marines under fire from German machine guns and flak guns. The Germans had about 50 men in Latashanka itself, with another 139 nearby, but there may have been some panzers in support which fired at the boats. One boat was sunk on the return journey and the other two were damaged, with one put completely out of action. The second wave came in with two new tugboats in addition to the one that had survived the first wave, but this time the German fire was so heavy that the damaged vessel from the first wave had to fall back after mortar rounds struck its deck. The horses that the Soviets had decided to ship across on the second wave, for some unknown reason, were found lying across the deck when it got back. In the end, only 600 of the 910 men actually reached the other bank, and the battalion commander decided to assault the German positions with his submachine gun, leading to a loss of command and control at the critical juncture. The attack split into three groups, one in the north, one in the centre and one in the south. The southern group of Soviet soldiers was wiped out completely by the Germans, and all the anti-tank guns were lost too, as was their one and only radio. Artillery fire then became uncoordinated as a result. Then German reinforcements arrived in the afternoon and counterattacked, pushing the central group into the north of Latashanka, where the surviving 114 men continued to resist. Not knowing what was going on the early morning of the 1st of November, the Chief of Staff of the 149th Rifle Regiment crossed over in a cutter with another 73 men under a hail of bullets and shells. He somehow managed to get across to reinforce the remnants of the landing force, radioing to the other side, telling them that he had formed an all-round defence. Later, the Germans counterattacked and managed to take the shoreline, cutting off the Soviets in a pocket inside Latashanka itself. Afonian tried to send another cutter across with men and ammunition, but the hopeless vessel was sunk by the Germans. Overall, it wasn't a good start to this operation. Meanwhile, outside the city, more changes were occurring, with the plan for Operation Uranus being refined. 63rd Army was renamed the 1st Guards Army, with Lilushenko taking control of the new army. Kuznetsov became deputy commander of Vatutin's southwestern front. The 13th Tank Corps was formed, with the 17th, 61st and 62nd Mechanized Brigades, and the 44th, 176th and 163rd Tank Regiments. So note, this was actually a proper tank corps of troops, rather than just being a tank division like previous tank corps had been. There was also a change on the German side. Schwedler, 4th Army Corps commander, suffered from an injury and had to be placed in the Führer Reserve. Therefore, Jennecke of the 389th Infantry Division was promoted to General de Pioneer and placed in command of the 4th Corps. Jennecke was then replaced as commander of the 389th Infantry Division by Major General Erich Magnus. And back inside the city, Barnbeck, who was in temporary command of the 305th Infantry Division, was replaced by General Steinmetz, allowing Barnbeck to go back to his old regiment in 71st Infantry Division. And if we zoom out slightly, by the 1st of November 1942, Paulus had in his possession more than 90% of the city of Stalingrad. But this wasn't 100%, and Paulus was under constant pressure from Hitler to finish the job, so he met with Seydlitz, Richthofen and General Fiebig, as well as their chiefs of staff, to discuss the situation. Richthofen confronted Paulus and Seydlitz, telling them that the infantry wasn't taking advantage of the support given to them by his Stukas. The artillery don't fire, and the infantry don't exploit our air attacks. We drop our bombs on enemy positions less than a hand grenade's throw from the infantry, but they do nothing. Paulus said he needed reinforcements and ammunition. Richthofen rejected this answer, stating that he could get Paulus more supplies. He blamed the situation on the conservatism of the troops and command, and pointed out that it was silly how divisions were only sending into combat 1,000 men when their ration strength was 12,000. Clearly he didn't understand what was happening on the ground. Paulus calmly repeated that he needed more men and ammunition, which caused Richthofen to falsely conclude that Paulus knew he was wrong but wouldn't admit it. Well, no, Richthofen was wrong. Paulus didn't have an army. It was barely a shell of what it had once been. By this point, the 79th, 94th and 305th Infantry, plus the 14th and 24th Panzer Divisions, were all no longer capable of attack. Thus, the immediate issue was the lack of manpower, and in order to get more men into the city, Paulus considered withdrawing the 305th Infantry Division and replacing it with the 60th Motorized Division. But when he rang von Weichs to discuss this plan, von Weichs had second thoughts. For starters, it would take until the 15th of November before the 305th and 60th Divisions could swap places, and that was too long. Secondly, the 60th Motorized Division was too weak to perform the job, since it had been holding the line in the north. 29th Motorized Division was in better shape, but it needed to remain on the flank in case of a Soviet attack. Thus, Paulus was left with nothing to finish Chuikov off with. Worse, many of the remaining troops were also physically weak. The poor diet and the general lack of food seemed to be causing jaundice, with many of the men compelled to go to the rear to be treated. Then again, Chuikov is no better off. He disbanded his army headquarters security company and sent it to reinforce the 39th Guards Rifle Division. Again, both sides had beat each other until they could punch no more, and it was down to Paulus to find the strength to give it another go. Could he do it? Let's find out. Kampfgruppe Bilo finally relieved the 212th Infantry Regiment and the Croatian Legion, placing 24th Panzer Division on the southern edge of the Red October factory. Kampfgruppe Winterfeld, with about 20 panzers, would act as the division's reserve. That evening, Soviet bombers dropped their bombs on Lenski's headquarters, and the general was lightly wounded but stayed with the troops. Overnight, from the 1st to the 2nd of November, the 161st and 241st Regiments of 95th Rifle Division reinforced the units fighting between the Barricade and Red October factories. Kampfgruppe Brandt and the 305th Infantry Division advanced towards the Volga, supported by Stugs and an assault by 389th Infantry Division. Desperate fighting occurred near the fuel tanks, but the 650th Regiment held its right-wing positions while counterattacking with its left wing. This action managed to halt the German attack. And after failing in their assault of 2 Soviet positions, the 545th Regiment alone suffered 64 casualties, and overall the front in the city remained largely static, as did the situation outside the city, although there were hints that something big was brewing. We must expect there to be continued reinforcement of the enemy confronting the Romanian Third Army, and possibly even an attack. We must wait further indications. There was another attempt to destroy Group Gorokov in the north. The 94th Infantry Division advanced slightly but were pushed back to their starting positions by what was left of the 149th Rifle Brigade. Bolvinov, their commander, was wounded and would die of those wounds, and another 328 men were also killed or wounded, leaving just 436 bayonets in the brigade. The 124th Brigade also only had 1,337 bayonets left, so this combined force of 1,773 men was barely holding on. Slightly further north, at Latashanka, a Soviet soldier swam back across the Volga to inform his superiors that German Stugs had arrived and the surviving shore party desperately needed support. Gunshots could be heard across the river, so Afanyin decided to send the 3rd Battalion over with some anti-tank guns, but they had to wait until the evening before they could cross, and when it went dark, and as they started their move, the Germans fired flares and spotted the rowing boats. Yes, rowing boats. There were some motorised boats in this wave as well, but they were forced to turn back, whereas the rowing boats kept going. Only one boat reached the other bank and the rest sunk or were forced to retreat, with casualties being high. Thus, on the 3rd of November, Afanyin tried again, sending 5 more boats across the river, all of which were subjected to fire, and only 4 returned. It now appeared that nobody had survived in Latashanka since everything went quiet, so somewhere in the region of 700 men had crossed and only a handful remained. Worse, it hadn't pulled any significant German forces away from Stalingrad, which had been the original intention, so it was a complete waste of lives. Galen, meanwhile, reported the day before that the Germans should expect the Soviets to continue to reinforce their fronts opposite the Romanian lines, and that there might be an attack. But on the 3rd he reported, "There emerges an increasingly clear picture of preparations for an attack on the Romanian Third Army, though they are in the early stages. We cannot be certain whether the objective is an attack designed to lure our forces away from Stalingrad or an operation with much broader objectives." According to Glantz, Galen favoured the former, meaning that he thought that a Soviet attack against the Romanians would only be a distraction to lure forces away from Stalingrad. So even by the 3rd of November, despite the reports coming in, the OKH were not informed that the Don flank was about to be hit by a major attack. And after his previous argument with Paulus, Richthofen had described to Jesenek and Hitler how important a role the pioneer battalions had played in their advance on the tractor factory. Grasping at straws, Hitler was convinced that these pioneers would achieve the final victory at Stalingrad. The Führer then suggested that the 4 German pioneer battalions helping to defend the Italian sector on the Don could be used in the city. Army Group B's Chief of Staff, Sondersten, rang Paulus and told him of the idea, saying that a 5th Pioneer Battalion in 6th Army's Reserve could be used as well. Paulus approved the idea, even though Schmidt had his reservations, saying that pioneers were not a substitute for infantry. At this moment, Seydlitz was of the opinion that it was possible to win in Stalingrad. All he needed, he said, was 4 Panzergrenadier battalions from the 29th Motorised Division and the 5 Pioneer battalions currently promised. Now, Pioneers could knock out bunkers and similar obstacles, but they weren't infantrymen and needed infantry support to secure an area. In other words, Pioneers needed to be subordinate to other infantry units in order to be effective. The problem was that Paulus had no infantry left. He asked Hitler for the Panzergrenadier regiments of the 29th Motorised Division, but Hitler refused to send them, being concerned about the southern flank of the 6th Army. This meant that the Pioneers weren't going to be as effective as they otherwise would have been, and it also highlights that Hitler was thinking of the flanks of the 6th Army, whereas Paulus and Seydlitz weren't. Something many of the history books get the other way around.
Still, the Pioneer battalions in question were the 45th, coming from 6th Army's reserve with 451 men, the 50th with 539 men from the 22nd Panzer Division, the 162nd with 437 men from the 62nd Infantry Division, the 294th with 408 men from the 294th Infantry Division, although only 328 men would be sent to Stalingrad, and the 336th with 382 men from the 336th Infantry Division. Paulus also organised another 300-man strong assault company from the 44th Infantry Division and a storm company from the 24th Panzer Division with 150 men. In total then, this was a reinforcement of 2,621 men.
At 1825 hours on the 3rd of November, the 6th Army, acting on orders from von Weich's Army Group B, ordered the final act to be prepared. This would be named Operation Hubertus. Seydlitz was to reorganise his forces for a strike against the Lazor chemical factory in a few days' time. In the meantime, the Pioneers would be transferred to the city and would undergo a brief urban warfare training regimen to get them prepared for Stalingrad. The guy in charge of the Pioneers at Stalingrad, Major Joseph Linden from the 672nd Pioneer Battalion, had this to say.
The assault would be launched on the 11th of November 1942. For the time of the attack, I chose the first light of day after the appropriate preparatory fire. Strong Pioneer assault groups, at least platoon strength, would push themselves into the starting positions under the protection of this fire. Then the artillery would be abruptly advanced. After this, the Pioneers would advance as the first wave and penetrate to their objectives while overcoming the enemy in known positions. Once there, they would immediately set themselves up for defence. Infantry would follow as a second wave and clear the enemy from the intermediate ground and subsequently take over the defensive line. Never before during the war had so many Pioneer battalions been concentrated for a single attack in so small an area. There was some fear that the Soviets would attack the Germans on the 7th of November 1942, since that was the anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. Apparently, Soviet prisoners were the ones saying this to the Germans. 51st Army Corps therefore said, should the enemy actually carry out an attack on the anniversary of his revolution, 7th of November, then there is only one thing to do, not a step back.
Well, I guess the Germans also issued a not a step back order too. Interestingly, Chuikov expected the Germans to attack them on the 7th to cast a shadow over their celebrations. But he knew that Paulus had little left, so any attack would be minor. Nothing much happened on the 4th of November or most of the 5th of November, with only small-scale probes occurring on either side. The only thing of note was that Lenski replaced Oberst Bilo with Oberst Schiller, thus creating Kampfgruppe Schiller. By the 5th, 2 of the Pioneer battalions had been airlifted into Stalingrad, and apart from the loss of 895th Regiment's commander to a Luftwaffe bomb, the only other thing worth mentioning was that 3 men from the Epic of Latashanka had managed to swim back across the Volga. Apparently around 7 men remained on the other side, preparing to strike north towards the 95th Rifle Division's lines. Somehow, they actually succeeded. although 5 of them limped over wounded. And in fact, this wasn't the last group. Another 20 men hid under a railway carriage for a few more days before being forced to surrender due to hunger. Thus, the Epic of Latashanka was finally over. A complete waste of time for the Soviets, but an interesting historical event nonetheless. If you want to read more about it, Isayev has an entire chapter dedicated to the Latashanka landing in his book Stalingrad City on Fire, so check it out if you haven't done so already.
At 23:15 hours on the 5th of November, Sonderston, the Chief of Staff for Army Group B, called Paulus and told him that Hitler and Zeitzler were questioning the next attack plan. Hitler felt that the barricading in Red October factories should be taken before dealing with the chemical factory. This went against the original intentions of the Army Group Command.
From what I can see, Army Group B had been the first to order that the chemical factory be taken, and Paulus had gone to implement their orders. But, with Hitler reconsidering, Paulus pointed out to Sonderston, who relayed the information to Zeitzler, that attacking the chemical factory first would allow Zeitlitz to turn and attack the other 2 factories afterwards, whereas if they got bogged down inside the barricading Red October factories, they might not have the strength to take on the chemical factory. But Paulus stated that he didn't have enough infantry, even with the fresh pioneer battalions, to take the chemical factory area, and would need more infantry battalions, specifically not pioneers, before he could take it. Sonderston and von Weichs, commander of Army Group B, expressed their own views.
We regard several small bridgeheads to be less dangerous than the one large bridgehead around the Lazor chemical factory, particularly once the Volga has frozen over. This large bridgehead may then represent a certain operational threat.
Hitler, though, agreed with Paulus. So, Paulus had originally wanted fresh infantry forces to be transferred in to be used against the chemical factory, but Army Group B didn't have anything to give Paulus. Then Army Group B issued the order to take the chemical factory, and Paulus, obviously changing his mind, and Hitler thought that finishing off the 2 northern factories first would be best. I point this out because some of the books suggest that Paulus had originally been the one to order the chemical plant to be taken out, and that he was overridden by Hitler. But when reassessing the sequence of events, that doesn't seem to be the case. Paulus had only wanted to strike the chemical factory if he got new infantry units first. When he didn't, he had second thoughts. Army Group B was still insisting on the attack, and Paulus then disagreed with them, with the debate getting passed up the chain of command all the way to Hitler. So, rather than Paulus being overridden by Hitler, it looks like Hitler agreed with Paulus and overrode von Weichs. I could be wrong, and if I am, fine, but regardless of what happened, Hitler insisted that the northern factories should be given priority, and Operation Hubertus, therefore, was postponed. And, to be honest, I think this was the right decision. The priority should be taking the final landing stage, which was in the area, and as Paulus himself pointed out, if they defeated the Soviet forces along this stretch of the Volga between the 2 factories, that would free up 3 or more divisions that could then be used against the remaining Soviet forces in the centre of the city, whereas if they struck the chemical plant area first, there was a good chance that they'd just get bogged down even more and not have enough forces to go north. So this was probably the right decision, but honestly, this indecision about which small group of buildings their army should attack first really highlights just how bankrupt the German forces were at this time. One Croatian legionary sums up the entire situation.
Fighting in Stalingrad is extremely hard. It is no longer a question of tactical or strategic gains, which is what the German army wants, because the city has become a huge pile of rubble and the Volga is under the practical control of German divisions. This whole thing is about prestige. The fighting here, so to speak, is a personal battle between the Führer and Stalin. Thus, the 2 northern factories became the priority. 3 groups were formed: Kampfgruppe Schwerin, tasked with taking the rest of the Red October factory; Kampfgruppe Seidel of 14th Panzer Division, ordered to protect the right flank of 305th Infantry Division and prevent Soviet forces from counterattacking between the two main divisions in the area, and a group centered around the 305th Infantry Division tasked with taking the strip of land between the Barricadi and the Volga.
But Seilitz and his subordinates now believed that splitting their forces and attacking the two factories at once was a mistake. Which is interesting because they didn't come to this conclusion earlier. In theory, prior to the previous attack on the Red October factory, the 79th Infantry Division could have concentrated in the Barricadi factory area alongside the other divisions and rolled south with them, a concentration of force. But it was, instead, sent into the Red October factory alone. So why was that considered a good strategy, but now splitting the troops is a mistake? Not sure. But Seilitz now prioritised the attack near the Barricadi factory and ordered Schwerin to send forces to the northern divisions. Meanwhile, the rain fell heavy on this day and the temperature suddenly dropped. Worse, chunks of ice or sludge appeared in the Volga. Churikov notes that the Volga was beginning to freeze, but not freeze solid, and these chunks of ice were hazardous for shipping. So in other words, his already tenuous supply lines were about to be cut, and Paulus's next attack might be striking at the perfect time.
By the 7th of November, Rommel was withdrawing from El Alamein, and Allied troops were landing in Morocco and Algeria. This was, in fact, the first time US ground troops had entered the European conflict. Hitler immediately gave orders to defend Tunisia, an action which would have a knock-on effect at Stalingrad. And a few days earlier, Goering had ordered bomber formations from Norway to head to North Africa, and Richthofen offered and sent some of his own air forces there too, even though his forces were stretched thin as it was. The departure of those valuable units, coupled with high attrition rates caused by supply difficulties and overcommitment, greatly weakened Luftwaffe 4's already inadequate bomber force, leaving it without the means to interrupt Soviet preparations or, even more importantly, to resist the massive attacks when they came.
In the city, rather than attack, Ludnikov's troops, 1,296 men on this side of the Volga, spent the anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution drinking vodka. One reinforcement battalion for the 45th Rifle Regiment spent the day wandering around on the eastern bank of the Volga because their commanders had got drunk and went missing. Some of the other divisions didn't receive their vodka rations at all, and more didn't even get food that day. Paulus's artillery and mortars, though, delivered a hefty barrage against Soviet artillery positions on the eastern bank. This bombardment would continue for 4 days in an attempt to reduce Soviet fire support for their troops inside the city.
The Croatians had also re-entered the line at this point and now tried to take Hall 4 with the other nearby German units. They were hit by heavy fire and ultimately failed to make progress. Several minor attacks went in against Hall 10, but the 24th Panzer Division easily repulsed them. On the 8th of November, Paulus intervened and ordered Seilitz to change his plans. Seilitz, in turn, ordered the 79th Infantry and 14th and 24th Panzer Divisions to each form an assault company of 150 men that would be sent to 100th Jaeger Division's control to spearhead future attacks. The only other thing of note on this day was that Hitler gave a speech in Munich where he barely mentioned Stalingrad at all, but when he did mention it, he assured his audience that it was in their hands. I wanted to reach the Volga and reach it at a certain location in a certain city. By coincidence, the city bore Stalin's name, but you should not think that I marched there for this reason. It could have had any other name. I did it because it is an important place. You can cut off traffic amounting to 30 million tonnes there, nearly 9 million tonnes of which are oil. All the wheat from the huge areas in the Ukraine and the Kuban region flows through there, so that it can be transported north. Manganese ore is brought there. It is a gigantic trade centre. That centre I wanted to take, and, as you know, we are modest. We have it. There are only a few small pockets left. Now the others say, then why do they not fight more quickly? Because I do not want a second Verdun. I prefer to do it with very small assault parties. Time makes no difference here. No ship comes up the Volga anymore. That is what is decisive. He also spoke about the elimination of the Jews and how peace was not on the table. His speech wasn't great and it backfired to some extent. If Hitler had hoped to reassure his wider audience with this speech, he failed dismally. The gap between boastful rhetoric and painful reality had become too large. Invoking Verdun before a public weary of a never-ending war, of soaring death tolls, and of increasingly destructive air raids, and against the backdrop of the Allied landing in North Africa, could only intensify concern that the regime had lost control of events. Moreover, in emphasising economic goals and admitting the slow pace of the battle, Hitler had implicitly criticised his own handling of the operation. Taking the city itself was irrelevant, and time, as he was about to discover, was important. Starting on the 9th, German bombers deployed against the Soviet build-up north of the Don. So, the Luftwaffe at least had noticed what was going on. Unfortunately, their efforts failed, partly because the Soviets built their bridges just below the water of the river, making it difficult to hit them, partly because Soviet fighters in the area put up fierce resistance, and partly because the Germans didn't have enough bombers available now to actually do enough damage to stop the Soviet build-up. Without enough bombers to strike Soviet airfields, German fighters had to circle over them to tempt the Soviet fighters into the air. The Soviets didn't take the bait, and they mostly stayed on the ground, saving their strength. On the 10th of November, the Soviet artillery rained down on the 24th Panzer Division's positions, and the 112th Regiment from the 39th Guards Rifle Division assaulted their lines. The Soviets were in the German positions before the Germans could react, engaging them in bitter hand-to-hand combat. The defenders quickly ran out of ammunition, with some forced back or having to hack their way out with their entrenching tools. Others were simply wiped out. More still had to hide in the rubble of Hall 10 until they could sneak back to friendly lines. Thus, the line fell back to the northern section of Hall 10, Hall 9, and the ground between Halls 10 and 8A. But the Soviets could go no further. Finally, Gehlen decided that, yes, there was an incoming Soviet attack, and that it was going to be a big one. He informed Zeitzler, but the High Command wasn't alarmed. They'd successfully thwarted numerous Soviet attacks on the flanks for months, since August in fact, so why should they be concerned now? Yes, the Axis Allied divisions were weaker than the glorious German divisions, but German divisions were in support of them, therefore everything would be fine, they thought. Hitler, though, had read Gehlen's reports and had already started transferring troops from France to Army Group B, and he did this before Gehlen had come to the conclusion that an attack was going to take place. On either the 4th or 6th of November, the sources vary, Hitler had cancelled the transfer of the Luftwaffe field divisions to the Axis Allied armies, instead deciding to send the 6th Panzer Division and 2 infantry divisions from France. Of course, these transfers would take weeks to occur, so the troops wouldn't arrive until December, but at least some action was being taken. Yet Gehlen was still believing that an attack would strike Army Group Centre. It was only on the 10th that he concluded that the Soviets would strike the Don, but even then he wasn't committed to the idea. As this discussion was going on, the Soviet army commanders, including Shumilov, were also being informed about the upcoming offensive, with divisions being transferred to the front line. The offensive was due to begin on the 13th of November, although the next day, the 11th of November, Zhukov would end up postponing it due to logistical problems. It's strange to think that we're just days away from a huge turning point in the Battle of Stalingrad, yet Paulus was still focused on taking a few buildings on the bank of the Volga. Nevertheless, he did react. The 48th Panzer Corps headquarters was moved to the 3rd Romanian Army area to act as an operational reserve. It received the German 22nd Panzer Division and the 1st Romanian Armoured Division as its subordinate formations. Then, on the 11th, the 6th Army's diary notes that Army Group B's headquarters
was keen to know what preparations Paulus was making in case the Soviets struck the Romanians at the Don. The Sixth Army informed them that a reserve force was being created at the Don, consisting of a few companies and battalions from the 14th Panzer Corps, and other units were being shuffled around that could be sent west when given the signal. This was all that Paulus could spare, but at least the Germans had noticed that something was going on. Of course, it was only a few days before Operation Uranus would begin, giving them little chance to react, but at least they had finally figured it out.
And after 2 weeks of stalemate, Seilitz's forces were now ready to launch their next attack. 389th Infantry Division had 2 regiments with 6 infantry battalions and 2 pioneer battalions mixed in, ready to strike south. The 305th Infantry Division had its 3 regiments deployed along the eastern edge of the barricaded factory, each supported by a pioneer battalion. There was also a force of 7 panzers from the 14th Panzer Division and the handful of Stugs that remained. Thus, Steinmetz had about 5,200 men versus a Soviet force of less than half that amount. In the middle, 14th Panzer Division's Kampfgruppe Seidel would support the attacks, and to the south, Zwarin planned to capture Hall 4 with a collection of units including 120 pioneers from its 179th Pioneer Battalion and another company of engineers from the 24th Panzer Division. Yes, their objective was one Hall, although Kampfgruppe Schiller, with all 7 panzers of the division, was tasked with retaking Hall 10 and pushing to the Volga, so technically it was 2 halls and a bit of a riverbank, but you get the idea.
Thus, Paulus's 5th offensive, if you could call it that, was about to begin. Would he be able to take the few remaining buildings that stood in his way? Would the pioneers be as decisive as Hitler hoped, and would Chuikov be able to hold on even though icebergs were floating down the Volga, cutting off his supplies? We'll find out next time. Thanks for watching, bye for now.